Before the hall doors, law stood firm while hunger shifted under every gaze. Ewan Quayle drove his staff against the frozen step of Midwinter Hall, and the crack rang over the square. Salt wind bit his face. Two brothers were shouting beside the well, each clutching the same sack of barley, while half the village watched to see whose word the reeve would trust. He stepped between them before fists could fly. The barley smelled damp and sour, as if it had lain too long near the shore. Ewan raised his free hand and named the rule. Grain claimed without witness would be held in the hall until market records could be checked. One brother, Tomas, turned white with anger. The other, Padraig, laughed once, without any joy, and said records did not fill a cooking pot. A murmur moved across the square. Children stood near doorways with shawls around their heads, and no one looked well fed. Ewan ordered the sack carried inside. He told himself the law must stand straight, especially in a hard season. If it bent for one man, the whole village would soon twist with it. Then old Myron Crane, who sold dried fish and knew every tide by smell, spoke from the edge of the crowd. She wore sealskin gloves with the fingers cut off, and frost silvered the black wool at her shoulders. "You hold the sack," she said, "but not the matter. On St. Stephen's Day, the Wren will show you what your books cannot." Some crossed themselves, some looked away. Ewan almost rebuked her for stirring old custom into public business, yet the square had gone quiet in a different way, as if everyone waited for his answer. "A bird will settle no dispute," he said. Myron met his eye. "No, but the feet that follow it might." The bird carried through snow. Street. Stephen's morning came with a sky the color of pewter. Boys and young men gathered near the chapel yard with ribbons, holly, and a small frame dressed for the Wren. Ewan went because a reeve could not ignore a custom that drew half his village into one body. From door to door, the small bird measured the village more keenly than any tally. He expected noise and foolishness. He found rhythm instead. A drum tapped like knuckles on a door, and a reed pipe gave a thin, bright cry that the wind kept trying to steal. Myron stood beside him, smelling of brine and peat smoke. "Look with your ears open," she said. He frowned at the phrase, yet he held his tongue. The Wren frame, no larger than a basket lid, passed from shoulder to shoulder. At each house the singers stopped, stamped snow from their boots, and called for alms in bread, oats, smoked fish, or coins. Some doors opened at once. At others there was a pause, then a hand came through the gap with a crust or a strip of herring. No one gave much. No one gave nothing. Ewan watched marks he had never noticed. Widow Kermode, who had paid her rents on time for 20 years, offered only 2 onions and lowered her eyes. The Farragher house gave oatcakes, yet the children behind the mother licked their lips as if the smell pained them. Tomas, one of the brothers, gave a measure of meal from a bin that looked close to empty. "You see want," Myron said. "Any man can see want. I need names and amounts. I need proof." She nodded toward the singers. "That is proof, only not the kind you keep on paper. The Wren goes where people cannot hide their hand. Pride hides in daylight. Hunger slips out at the threshold." At noon the company reached the shore road, where kelp lay dark on the stones and gulls cried above the tide. Padraig, the other brother, stood by an upturned boat with his wife and little son. He gave nothing. He only bowed his head while the child stared at the basket frame with wide eyes. A sharp murmur rose behind Ewan. Refusing the Wren company in such weather was not a small thing. Padraig's wife drew the boy behind her skirts. Ewan stepped forward. "Why do you shut your door to the custom?" Padraig looked at the sea before he answered. "Because I have nothing fit to offer. If I hand out emptiness in front of the village, will that warm my son?" The boy coughed then, a dry sound that seemed too large for his chest. Myron did not speak. She only rested her hand on the boat's rim and waited. Ewan felt the rule rise to his lips. Every household must contribute in common observance. Yet he could see the cracked bucket, the mended net, the boots stuffed with straw. The camera of his own stern mind caught details it had ignored before. He said, "Come to the hall at dusk. Bring your account, and Tomas will bring his." Padraig's jaw tightened. Accounts are easy for men with cupboards. That evening, before either brother arrived, a child burst into Midwinter Hall with snow on his sleeves. He said someone had broken the lock on the parish store shed above the harbor. 2 sacks of rye were gone. Ewan grabbed his lantern and ran uphill. The shed door hung crooked. Iron scraped wood in the wind, and grain dust lay on the floor like pale sand. On the lintel, pinned under a nail, someone had left a wren feather. For the first time that day, the old custom ceased to look harmless. Tracks between hearth and tide. By lantern light the village looked stripped to bone. Ewan knelt at the broken shed and touched the lock. Fresh metal burrs scraped his glove. The thief had not used skill, he had used haste. Under one broken lock looked simple, the night around it did not. Men began naming suspects before he even asked. Tomas accused Padraig. Padraig accused Tomas. A cooper blamed lads from the upper lane. Someone else muttered about boatmen from outside Peel. Each guess came fast, as if blame itself might fill the empty space where grain had been. Ewan lifted the feather from the nail. It was small, barred, and dry. "No one leaves the hill," he said. "Not until I hear each house in order." A groan ran through the crowd. People wanted the matter clean and quick. Ewan had wanted that too, until the Wren road had shown him another shape beneath the quarrel. He started with the nearest cottages. At each hearth he asked the same three things: what was in the house, who had gone out after dark, and what had been promised to kin. The answers did not line up, yet they did not point one way either. At Widow Kermode's house, cabbage water steamed in a black pot, thin as green rain. Her grandson admitted he had seen two figures on the slope but could not swear to faces. In the Faradher cottage, the father swore no one had passed, yet his daughter pointed at the table where 8 people had shared one heel of bread. She pressed her lips shut the moment her father saw her. That was the first time Ewan felt shame touch him like cold water. He had spent weeks checking seals, weights, and carts, while Holmes emptied one bite at a time. The law had counted sacks. It had not counted silence. Near midnight he reached Myron's hut above the strand. Fish hung from rafters, and the room smelled sharp with salt and smoke. She placed a cup of hot broth before him and waited until he drank. "Why the feather?" he asked. "Because whoever took the grain wanted you to follow the custom, not the lock," she said. "You speak as if theft can be a message. Any act can be. The question is whether the village can bear the hearing of it." He set the cup down. "If a man steals, I punish him. If I do not, others will do the same." Myron spread her weathered hands toward the fire. "When the sea takes a boat, do you find the tide? A winter theft may begin with one hand, but hunger stands behind that hand with all its weight. Find the first hand, yes. Then find the weight." He looked at the broth, at the fish strips, at the neat stack of peat by her wall. "You have enough." She gave a short laugh. "Because I am old and know where the sea stores its gifts. Must a child know that too? Must a widow climb rocks in black water?" Before he could answer, a knock sounded. Tomas entered, red-eyed and stiff with cold. He carried a scrap of sailcloth dusted with rye. "I found this under Padraig's boat," he said. An hour later, Padraig stood in the hall with his wife and son beside him. The child leaned against her skirt, half asleep. Ewan laid the sailcloth on the table. Padraig did not deny it. "I moved one sack," he said. "Not two. I took it from the shed to my net loft and meant to return half when Tomas stopped calling me thief in the square. Then someone else came before dawn and took the rest." Tomas surged forward, but Ewan struck his staff on the boards. The sound snapped through the room. "You confess to theft from the parish store," Ewan said. Padraig bowed his head. "I confess to fear. My son had not eaten since yesterday morning. Punish me, but if you stop there, you stop early." Ewan heard Myron's words under the roar in his own blood. "Find the weight," he ordered. Padraig held in the side room, not bound, and called for lanterns. "We search every loft, cellar, shed, and smokehouse before first light," he said. "Not for a culprit alone. For truth." The locked loft above the net house. The search moved through the village like a tide that entered every crack. Hinges groaned. Dogs barked and then fell quiet. People stood aside with blankets around their shoulders while Ewan's lantern showed what pride had hidden in daylight. Behind one neat rope, enough grain waited to turn neighbors against each other. He found little in most places. A jar of limp carrots. A bag of oats mixed with chaff. Salted limpets. A heel of cheese hard as wood. Yet at each stop another truth came loose. Tomas had lent meal in autumn and wanted it back before his own mother went hungry. Padraig had sold his spare net to buy coal for his son's fever. Widow Kermode had fed 2 neighbor children for 6 days without speaking of it. No record in Midwinter Hall held these facts. They lived in tired hands, in patched elbows, in the way people looked at one another across a room. Just before dawn they reached the old net house by the harbor wall. It belonged to Bran, a trader who bought fish, barley, and wool, then sold what the storms had spared. He met them outside in a fur cap and smiled too quickly. My loft is locked because rats get in, he said. Ewan held out his hand. The key. Branna touched his belt, then spread his palms. Lost yesterday. Myron, standing near the door, bent to the threshold. She picked up a grain kernel and rubbed it between finger and thumb. Rats do not tie knots, she said. A fresh rope sealed the latch from outside. Ewan ordered the door forced. The bar gave after 2 blows. Inside, the air smelled of burlap and dry meal. Lantern light climbed stacked sacks, more than any honest Count Branna had entered in the parish book. For a moment no one spoke. Then Tomas made a low sound, almost a sob, and Padraig's wife covered her mouth. Branna drew himself up. I bought what was mine to buy. Men sold willingly in autumn. I kept back stock so prices would not collapse. By February this grain would have fed us all, and I would have made a fair return for risk. Fair, Tomas said, taking one step forward. Ewan raised his staff again. He did not strike, he only held it across Tomas's chest, and Tomas stopped. The room tightened around that pause. This was the moment Ewan had long believed in, the offender clear, the hidden store uncovered, the rule ready in his mouth. Seize the grain, find the traitor, name the offense, close the matter. Yet the faces before him kept him from that easy road. If he shamed Branna alone, the village would cheer for a night and wake hungry still. Men who had sold low in autumn would hate those who had held back. Families would guard old insults like embers. The winter would keep feeding on them. He turned to Branna. How many sacks are entered in your account? 12. And here. Branna said nothing. Myron walked to a pile and laid her palm on the burlap. Count them with your own tongue, she said. 27, he muttered. A hard stillness fell. Ewan felt the cost of the next words before he spoke them. If he followed habit alone, he would jail Branna and call the work done. If he did more, he would have to ask the whole village to stand under one rule, himself included. At noon, he said, the bell will call every household to Midwinter Hall. This grain will be carried there in open sight. Branna Tyr will stand before the village and hear the count. So will Tomas, Padraig, and I. We each failed a part of our charge. Today we answer for it together. Branna stared at him. You would put yourself in the same line. Ewan met his gaze. I kept order on paper while cupboards emptied. That also has a price. The bell in Midwinter Hall. By noon the hall was full, and cold still lived in the corners. The grain sacks stood along the wall where all could see them. Melted snow darkened the floorboards, and the bell rope swayed above the crowd from its recent pull. In the hall's hard light, each household brought its need into the open. Ewan stood on the low dais with no clerk beside him. He wanted no screen of ink between his words and the people who had to bear them. Myron sat near the front on a bench, hands folded over her cane. He began with the count, the missing parish rye, the hidden sacks in Branna's loft, the false entry in the traitor's book. Murmurs rose, but he lifted his staff for quiet. Then he did a thing no one expected. He named his own failure first. I saw disputes and answered with storage seals and warnings, he said. I did not ask who had coal, who had broth, who had children coughing at night. I kept law narrow when winter had turned wide. The room shifted, not softly. People straightened as if some cord had loosened inside them. Then Tomas spoke without being asked. He admitted he had pressed hard on debts after the first frost because fear for his own house had made him hard. Padraig admitted the theft of one sack and bowed his head before the village. His wife did not weep. She only stood with one hand on her son's shoulder. At last Ewan turned to Branna. You hid grain while prices rose and kitchens thinned. Speak plain. Branna looked toward the door, as if measuring escape, then saw none. I feared ruin, he said. Last year 2 boats failed and I carried losses alone. I thought if I held stock, I could survive this winter and the next. And if others failed first? Myron asked from the bench. He shut his eyes. I did not look that far. Silence held the hall. Outside, wind pressed against the shutters with a slow, steady hand. Ewan could have passed sentence alone. He felt that old power waiting for him, clean and sharp. Instead he looked at the sacks, the faces, the children near their mother's skirts, the men who had stopped meeting one another's eyes. He finally understood what Myron had meant. The Wren custom was not a chase. It was a circuit. It carried one small body through every threshold until no door could pretend it stood apart. He spoke so the back wall could hear. The stored grain returns first to the parish count. From it, Each household receives winter shares by number and need, and the list will be read aloud each market day. Branatir will surrender his false prophet and work under watch on harbor repairs until spring. Padrig will repay the parish sack by labor, not coin, because his child cannot eat shame. Tomas will forgive old interest on autumn meal where hunger was the cause. I will keep the hall open twice each week, and each house may speak need before dispute turns into theft. A man near the door called, "Who decides need?" Ewan answered at once, "Not I alone. 4 elders, 1 fisher, 1 farmer, 1 widow, and 1 mother with young children will sit the count with me. The village will hear every measure." There was risk in that. Shared judgment could move slowly. It could wound pride. It could expose want in front of neighbors. Yet the faces before him no longer looked like a crowd waiting for orders. They looked like people weighing whether they could trust one another again. Myron rose with effort. The room made space for her. She drew the small wren feather from her sleeve and placed it on the nearest grain sack. "The bird is not king," she said. "It is small enough to enter any hedge. That is why people chose it. In winter, truth survives in scraps. Go collect scraps, and you may keep a village alive." No one laughed. No one argued. Tomas crossed the floor first and faced Padrig. For one tense breath Ewan thought the quarrel would start anew. Instead Tomas said, "Your boy can take broth at our hearth tonight. After that, we count straight." Padrig swallowed and nodded. That was all. It was enough. Before dusk, the sacks were opened and measured. Women brought bowls. Men fetched scales. Children carried smaller parcels under watchful eyes. The hall filled with the smell of rye, fish, damp wool, and peat smoke from the brazier. It did not smell like comfort. It smelled like work shared in time. When the last family stepped out into the blue dark, Ewan remained by the door. Snow had begun again, soft and steady. Myron passed him on her way home. "Did the wren settle the dispute?" he asked. She tucked her cane under her arm and pulled her shawl close. "No, people did. The bird only showed you where to listen." He watched the tracks leading from the hall in many directions, each pair fading into the same white road. Then he barred the door, not to keep the village out, but to guard what the village had chosen together.